We do want to bring in Seth Berenzweig, a business and compliance attorney, to speak more about this. Seth, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
My pleasure.
So I do want to get straight out to the breaking news that happened this morning after a judge dismissed a juror after she expressed concerns about being impartial, alluding to the fact also that family members and friends really were questioning, perhaps pressuring her for being part of this case. What can you share about this very latest development?
Well, this really shows the intricacies and difficulties of impaneling a jury in a very high-level case. Naturally, this is one of the highest-level cases, if not the biggest case of the decade, and some would even argue perhaps the century. And given the huge level of media attention, this apparently is what happened. You were absolutely correct that there were two factors that were listed by this oncology nurse. Her concern with regard to being fair and impartial, but quite frankly, I think the other point was the one that really convinced her to leave. What happened was that there was a reverse engineering process essentially as to what was going on with the media, where the media, given the current questionnaires, is able to report where the person works as well as their general physical appearances. So as all this was going on and this was being reported, she went home, and yesterday, Wednesdays, the court is in recess, and people were able to start to figure it out. And she was starting to get calls from her friends and colleagues saying, wait a minute, are you one of the jurors in this case? And she felt very intimidated. So when they got back into court, Judge Merchan has set new ground rules. So for example, the backgrounds, the qualifications in terms of what their occupations are is not going to be publicly shared. And he's also discouraged the media from providing any kind of physical descriptions, which I think will also probably put the kibosh on court artists. So this is a very interesting development. Up until this point, this was a smooth running machine, but now they basically hit a bump in the road. They're now down to 6. They have to impanel 12 jurors plus 6 alternates. I still think this is going to get done by approximately the early portion Monday of next week.
And you mentioned that there were folks in the media who managed, and even maybe family and friends, who were able to really identify this nurse, even though jurors are supposed to remain anonymous. And again, as I just listed, because it is public knowledge, the employment of the current jurors who are still seated, could there be concern that some of the remaining jurors might also then feel uncomfortable or receive that attention that really shouldn't be had?
Well, I think you've identified a real risk and a real problem that's happening right now. Because if I'm on that panel and I'm one of the 6, I'm thinking, okay, this has happened. Now what's going to happen next? Now, of course, they should not be following media, and Judge Merchan has probably instructed them that they're not supposed to talk about the case. They're not supposed to read up on the case. But I think that you've identified a practical reality of the day. So this is an impact, and it also is crossing over into a development that could also impact jury selection in the overall juror process, because Mr. Trump has now been accused by the prosecution, and at this point it's only an allegation, that he has allegedly violated the gag order. So there's a lot of heat in the room that's going on right now. The temperature in the courtroom is definitely going up.
Yeah, and I have to ask you, again, it's not common for a jury to be sequestered, but again, this is a landmark case. It has worldwide attention on it. Could that also be a factor once the jury is seated? Because again, I have to imagine there's so much attention, it's almost impossible for there not to be perhaps some of those outside influences.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only from that perspective, but each juror is going to have to give up a huge chunk of their life. They're not going to live a normal life for the next 6 to 8 weeks. And that is something that's going to have a significant impact, not only on the jurors that will ultimately be seated, but on the folks that are walking into the room, because they're going to be asked whether they have the ability to sit on the jury. And that's going to have an effect as well. Most jury trials get done in under a month, even for the most complex. And while I think the prosecution is going to try to keep this case very tight, and that there's a commonality with regard to a lot of the 34 alleged Class E felonies, it's probably going to take over a month, and it would be about 6 weeks. So I agree with you. I think that having this kind of a trial is complex under any circumstance, but doing this with a former president, it's really an extraordinary development and a historic moment in American history.
Now, today, of course, this morning, a judge dismissed one of the 7 jurors, now down to 6. They now have to seat 7. But in regards to the timeline of jurors being sworn in, is this a typical time frame? Has this gone on slower than usual or faster than what is normal?
In a general perspective, I think that it's happened a little more quickly than some had anticipated before hitting this speed bump. It was actually going pretty well. Judge Merchan has demonstrated he is absolutely in control of the courtroom. He's going to move this along quickly. And there was also a moment where Mr. Trump had made some gestures towards a potential juror. And when they left the courtroom, the judge chastised Mr. Trump. Of course, Mr. Trump's attorneys disagreed with that. But all for the point of saying that Judge Merchan is a judge that is very much in control of the courtroom. He's moving it along. The jury selection process is moving apace. So I believe that they're going to get this done, if not by tomorrow, that it will be completed by early next week. And then early next week, the 2 hearings that will happen is there'll be a hearing with regard to the alleged violation of the gag order, which includes 7 alleged new violations that have been pointed out by the prosecution. There will also be something called a Sandoval hearing, which in New York is shorthand for talking about a qualification of the cross-examination questions on credibility that the prosecutors may ask Mr. Trump if he takes the stand. I don't think he will. I think that the likelihood of him testifying is somewhere between slim and none, and I think Slim already left town. But we'll see how things evolve as we get into the trial next week.
And you answered one of the questions that I was going to talk about, which is this gag order and the district attorney wanting to hold Trump in contempt of court. You mentioned that that hearing is going to happen next week. But what could potentially play out? Because the DA was saying we want to fine the former president $3,000, and he also threatened 30 days of jail time. What could happen? What are those scenarios? And what is the likelihood of the judge to actually hold Trump in contempt of court?
So in a situation like this, you see a direct head-on collision between a citizen's First Amendment right for freedom of expression colliding with potentially the right of the American judiciary system, and in this case, a New York State court, to be able to faithfully apply the laws in a manner where the witnesses and the jurors are not subject to potential intimidation. There's a balancing, of course, that Judge Merchan is going to have to do. Mr. Trump's probably walking a tightrope right now. If there is any kind of discipline that's going to be assessed, I think it'll be a progressive discipline. I would be utterly shocked if he's put in jail on Monday or Tuesday, but I do think that he's going to have to mind his P's and Q's, if you know what I mean. He'll probably get a warning. The prosecution will not get what they ask for, but this is going to be a common theme that will occur throughout the trial, and you'll see a collision between the First Amendment and the court applying its process to ensure that there is not only a orderly administration of the case, but quite frankly, a fair trial for Mr. Trump. Because if there is something regarding a defect with the jury, then that's appealable error. So for all parties concerned, everybody should have this trial moving smoothly. There will certainly be a lot of developments, and these hearings will occur the early portion of next week.
Going back to jury selection, because jury selection resumes today, and again, 12 jurors have to be seated in addition to alternates being selected. When we took a look at the occupations and demographics of the previous jurors who have already been seated, what can we make out of that? Is there anything that jumps out at you, anything significant in terms of the jurors who have already been selected?
You know, I found it to be really interesting in terms of the makeup of the jury. I found them to be diverse, balanced. You have a couple of attorneys. One actually works for Disney. There's an independent IT consultant. The jury foreman is a male who works in the IT field. I think that it's a diverse jury. It's interesting that as we sit here today, as to the 6 that we are now down to, 4 males, 2 females. If I'm Mr. Trump and his attorneys, I think I would prefer to have males on the jury. Again, this is more art than science, but I think the judge is doing a very good job. We'll see where we are at the end of the day, but right now, I think that the jury selection process is being handled well, not only by the judge, but by the way, by the attorneys. I would like to just note a compliment for Mr. Trump's attorneys in the process. They're being very diligent. They're looking at social media posts, and they have found some interesting things that they are now challenging the jurors on, and they're being very diligent as well. So there's a lot to handle, but we can expect opening statements to begin by Monday or Tuesday.
And you brought up a really good point that I also wanted to ask you, in that Trump's attorneys are asking questions about social media, professional, personal. What are some of those questions that really could weed out folks? Obviously, I imagine that all of these questions are to determine whether there could be a bias.
That's exactly right. Are they partisan? Are they partial or impartial? Do they show some kind of a political or partisan tendency, which would indicate that it is not likely that they would be able to be fair and impartial in weighing the evidence in this case? So that's exactly what they're looking for. I thought that the attorneys that are representing Donald Trump are doing a very good job on that. Prosecutors are on their game. The lead prosecutor is very renowned for being a very astute, sharp trial attorney, but compliment to Mr. Trump's attorneys for really being on top of it. When you're in a jury room and you're getting ready for a jury trial, there are so many moving balls that are up in the air. You have names, you have to correlate them with the numbers, you have to correlate them with the jury questionnaire. There's a lot going on in that courtroom. The attorney's jobs in that phase are not easy. Jury trials, sometimes the hardest part is impaneling and getting ready for the trial, because once you start, you, as an attorney, you have your opening argument and your first direct examinations ready to go. So they've got their hands full.
The legal system, as you mentioned, is such as this court case, already nuanced and challenging, and you add on top of it the worldwide attention that it's getting, that just ramps it up even that much more. Seth, as we look for today in terms of more potential jurors to be selected and in the coming days, is there anything that you really want to highlight or let our viewers here on Live Now from Fox be aware of?
Sure. I would, first of all, I would look at the pace. How many do we have seated today? That pace will help us extrapolate a pretty good guesstimate of when the trial will start. It'll also be interesting to see when the judge holds the Sandoval hearing. He can really hold it at any point, and that will probably take a couple of hours. But the closest thing that I would keep an eye on is two things. What is the pace at which we're able to impanel a jury? And are we going to have any more sputtering or any more bumps in the road in terms of another juror coming in and saying, Your Honor, I'm sorry, but my friends were able to reverse engineer that I'm on this jury. So is this a one-time occurrence? If it happens again, then we can expect perhaps some kind of a slowdown in the process. But I think that the judge is taking care of this. So I expect that things will move a little bit more smoothly today and tomorrow.
All right, Seth Berenzweig, a business and compliance attorney, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox and sharing this perspective. It's absolutely just a fascinating trial in terms of historical perspective, in terms of developments, and no doubt we will be speaking with you again as we continue to follow all of these developments very closely. Thank you.